Hello and a big, massive welcome back to HR Hacks and Halos, a podcast that's dedicated to calling out workplace culture and changing it one episode at a time. Now, today's episode is very much about tariffs and what it sugar. I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. Cancel. Hello and welcome back to HR Hacks and Halos, a podcast dedicated to calling out and changing company culture one episode at a time. With me, your host, Jivan Dempsey. I'm a HR consultant and I'm passionate about changing the way we work through people, through process and technology. And I've been doing that for over 20 years now. In today's episode, I'm really wanting to untangle the truths about tariffs. What's their impact on business? What's the impact on HR? And what is the impact on us, ordinary people like you and me? I think intrinsically and instinctively, we all know that tariffs are bad. But why are they bad? And how can they actually make an impact on our lives? And maybe they're not as bad as we think. Maybe we're just keeping a very negative view of it because that's what we're being told to think. What I want to do is untangle that story through the eyes of John Taylor. John Taylor is a businessman and he is experiencing tariffs, but it's also the story of his workforce, his business, and some of the decisions that perhaps he and you might need to make as a consequence of the tariffs and how those tariffs are actually affecting him and society as a whole. So why not go and grab a coffee and settle down and let's dive in. So let's talk about John Taylor. He is the third generation owner of a mid-size UK manufacturing company, and it produces high quality electrical components. It's not sexy, but it's a steady business. It's weathered so many different things recently, significant things like Brexit. It's weathered supply chain chaos. It's weathered even COVID and managed to somehow come through and still be viable and still offering those important jobs that his community needs. But nothing really prepared John and his business for what came in April 2025, and that is a spike in his costs as a consequence of global tariffs. And it took us all by surprise, didn't it? The so-called Liberation Day. So when the UK government actually retaliated against the new US steel and aluminium tariffs, it actually introduced its own tariff on imported machinery components from abroad. And suddenly John's inputs, which had previously maybe afforded him comfortably from Asia around 35%, was suddenly so much more expensive. And over 60% of his supply chain has been hit. So as a consequence, his costs are soaring. His clients are pushing back, orders are drying up, staff morale and hours are cut, and people are now beginning to vote with their feet and he's beginning to lose his talent. But of course, John, he's not alone. Across the UK, hundreds of SMEs are actually feeling the very same pinch. So let's just take a step back for a moment. Let's just rewind. What are tariffs? Well, tariffs are essentially, they're a tax, and they're imposed on by governments on imported goods or services. The idea is to make those imported products more expensive, to give the local industries more of a competitive edge, and to try and focus and to build up local industry. I think in principle it sounds good, right? But here's the rub. Tariffs do tend to backfire. If you think about the data that comes out of the IMF, if tariffs are in place and they're prolonged, they can actually increase domestic production by about 15 to 25%. They can also suppress overall GDP growth by 0.4, 1.2%. Now, you might think that's quite minuscule, but when you think about the massive numbers that we're talking about for GDP, they are actually quite significant. And globally, they can restrict trade flow by over £330 billion annually. So in short, tariffs are they're a bit like economic speed humps. They slow things down, but not just for imports. They actually slow things down for everyone. So suddenly, a ripple that tariffs are actually bringing in can actually become quite a wave, because for John, for example, the local pain that he's experiencing around his costs, around losing people, actually has global echoes because he's had to lay off, sadly, 30% of his factory staff. Now, that means that the town's unemployment has suddenly jumped. Local shops therefore see fewer customers, and consumer confidence in that area, and in the wider area actually, is dropping. And inflation? Well, it never takes very long for inflation to follow suit, does it? The Bank of England suddenly found that post-Brexit and pandemic era trade restrictions, including tariffs, were actually adding between 1% and 3% to inflation. So that's not necessarily good news for anyone, because companies like John's are actually going to end up passing those increased costs to consumers. That means you and me. So the World Trade Organization warns that if tariffs remain in place, it can actually lead to a thing called stagflation. So the World Trade Organization is actually warning that if tariffs are not lifted and they stay in place for a long while, it can actually lead to stagflation, which means stagnant growth and high prices. And if consumers therefore stop spending, we actually enter recession territory. So all in all, it's not good news, is it? Tariffs are actually impacting quite significantly. So what about HR? Where does HR come into all of this? What role can we as practitioners actually play? Well, in John's case, things are quite personal because John's HR director, let's call her Priya for the sake of argument, she plays a very quiet but actually a critical role. What she's been doing is she's been running redundancy consultations, and she's been running those with compassion and with clarity and making sure that she's communicating clearly so that everyone is aware of what's going on and is in the picture. She's also been partnering with local job centres to support outplacement schemes to help those people that are going to be affected to actually go and find new positions and to go and find other jobs out in the community that can actually be made available to the people in John's workforce. She's also been creating retraining schemes for roles that aren't directly impacted by the tariffs. And she's also advocating for 4-day weeks in order to save jobs. So why is that important? Because it means that if you have flexible working, when the tariffs are lifted or the impacts of the tariffs suddenly start to balance out, then everyone can then be ramped up or down accordingly in order to, as new work and new contracts start to come on stream, without necessarily having to lose everyone. And here's the genius part. She's also pushing for supply chain scenario planning in her workforce strategy meetings with her business, because as Priya said, tariffs isn't just a tax, it's actually a trigger. So she's embedding herself into the business, into the operation, so that the HR conversations are not just a byproduct, they're actually very much at the forefront of all conversations with managers. So let's sort of take, again, let's just step out of John's shoes for just a moment and just think about the economic backdrop and some of the case studies that are out there that are actually happening that we can actually sort of reflect on and wonder if maybe some of these patterns are going to be repeating themselves over the tariffs that have been introduced this year. In 2018 to 2020, the US tariffs on Chinese imports hit around 550 billion pounds worth of dollars, should I say, worth of goods. And studies by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York sort of estimated those tariff costs to be costing the US household around $1,277 annually. Now, that's the cost of the tariffs that the US themselves imposed on the Chinese imports. Job growth in manufacturing slowed down. Farming exports plummeted. Soybean farmers in the Midwest actually saw losses of over 10 billion. Here's another example, a UK example. This is post-Brexit tariffs. Sectors like automotive and food processing. So here's a UK example. So what about some examples from the UK? Well, post-Brexit, we actually introduced a tariff on sectors. No, we didn't. Sorry, start again. Right. And what about in the UK? So post-Brexit, sectors like the automotive and food processing industries saw costs actually jumped by 20 to 30%. And in 2021, Cadbury's actually considered moving more of their production abroad due to the tariffs on chocolate ingredients. And this was mainly imposed by the EU. And a Make UK survey found that 43% of UK manufacturers were actually considering reshoring, i.e., moving their offshoring operations, production, sales, R&D, what it was, back into the UK, which, by implication does mean fewer jobs abroad. But actually, as those jobs come back, will result in higher costs at home. Why? I know it sounds like an anathema because you want those jobs to come home, don't you? But if you think about it, who's going to be doing those jobs? What are the costs of the skills that are going to have to be employed in order to do those jobs? The jobs are going to end up costing businesses more because our cost base is higher in the UK. And of course, businesses are going to end up passing those costs back to the consumer. So there is an inward and a reverse effect cost implication that happens as a consequence of that as well. So what are the other things that HR can do? So what's your role in all of this? Whether you're an HRD in a factory or an advisor in a financial services firm, tariffs will always affect people. And people are essentially our business, aren't they? So what about a checklist? Is there a checklist? I love a checklist. There's a checklist here. First of all, let's think about workforce planning. Why not think ahead and build in a trade and think about your trade disruption scenarios? What are the roles that could be affected if suppliers or markets actually shift? Here's an opportunity for you to do some kind of modeling around what could be the broader external scenarios that could affect here, and how is that going to actually impact your business and the people and the skills that you are working so hard to try and maintain. 2, what about well-being strategies? Financial stress and tariffs and the impact on our, cost of living, the stress of that actually does rise as inflation starts to rise. So think about employee hardship funds. Think about maybe financial literacy sessions, even salaries, sacrifice schemes to help people through very difficult times. And just for people, your workforce, to know that you actually are helping them and supporting them in when times get a bit tough. What about talent retention? We know that your good people, when uncertainty strikes, tend to get a bit jumpy and will move. And of course, we don't want that, because as things settle down, it's usually the high talent that we want to kind of kickstart again and move forward. So if they get jumpy, why not try and avoid that by communicating honestly and frequently? You can never communicate enough in a situation like this. And also think about what internal mobility pathways that you can think about or put in place so that you can kind of encourage your talent to be thinking more around their career, as opposed to so that they are wanting to stay and really feel that their future still lies with the business. What about doing a skills audit? Do you think your workforce is ready to pivot to roles that are more insulated by global trade wars? Why not think about what you can do with digital or with automation? What about skills audit? Do you think your workforce can pivot to roles that are more insulated from global trade wars? What about things like digital or automation, compliance, R&D? All of these sorts of things aren't immediately impacted by tariffs and by trade wars. So, maybe you could think about how your staff can pivot, and you can protect them to a certain degree for a certain period of time if they're focusing in on those roles. Again, that could be part of your scenario planning as you think broader and as you think around what you need to do to protect your business from uncertainty as a consequence of any tariffs that may be coming down the pipeline. Or if, as they're here already, what happens if they are still very much on the table? What about policy advocacy? HR doesn't always sit at the policy table. We're not always there in the decision-making process. Change that. Work with your senior teams, your legal teams, your operations to flag that tariffs are actually affecting people too, not just the cost base, not just about products, not just about your supply chains. They're actually affecting people, and people do impact profits. And that's the message that I think we need to get across, that actually any scenario planning, if it's happening without the HR colleagues at the table, it just isn't worth it. And really, it's down to you to really kind of make sure that message is actually hitting home. So finally, what's John's legacy in all of this? Well, I'd like to think that in the end, John hasn't lost everything and his business hasn't gone to the wall. I'd like to think that with Priya's help, he downsized, he restructured his business, and he started to source his components, etc., from within the UK. It wouldn't have been easy for him, and he probably would have seen an awful lot of his workforce and his friends and colleagues actually having to leave the business, but his business would have turned a corner. And here's the lesson. Tariffs may feel like a distant policy decision, but, they do ripple into the homes and the jobs and the futures of us, us real people, and will impact our futures. So the next time you hear about a new trade tariff in the news, just ask yourself, what does this mean for my workforce? What could this mean for me and my family? What can it mean for your workforce resilience and their pay packets and their futures? What can it mean again for their families? Because HR isn't just here to clean up after the storm. We can be there as part of the early warning system, and sometimes we can be there for the life raft. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of HR Hacks and Halos. I do hope that you found it informative, and if my story about John has struck a chord, then please do share this podcast with a colleague or a CEO who maybe still thinks that HR doesn't need a seat at the strategy table, because quite frankly, they do. And it's time that CEO recognizes the value that HR can actually do. So till next time, thank you so much again for listening. Stay sharp, stay human. And we will again, for the next episode, share some more HR hacks, and we can share some more and polish. No, that was a bit meh. Anyway, so till next time, stay sharp and stay human. And so we will be again polishing some more. Oh, let's just rewind all of that. So thanks again for tuning in to today's episode of HR Hacks and Halos. I do hope it struck a chord, particularly when it comes to tariffs and what you can do in terms of preparing for them. Or if you know a CEO who still thinks that HR doesn't need a seat at the table, because quite frankly, they do, why don't you let them know about this episode of HR Hacks and Halos? Please do share it and make sure that they're aware of the messages within this one. So till next time, stay sharp, stay human, and stay ready for the unexpected. So again, till next time, we'll be ready to give you some more HR hacks, and together we can polish some more HR halos. See ya.